Joseph Newton Chandler, a loner living in the suburbs with a big secret.
Always had a suitcase packed. He was always ready to go.
Hiding his true identity for decades.
Why did he run away from his family and change his identity and live like this?
His name stolen, his family abandoned.
Was he paranoid because he knew he owed mom all that money, or was he paranoid about what had happened in California?
What was this man running from? Was he a fugitive, a notorious serial killer, or did he just want a fresh start?
You have just a normal guy, or do you have the Zodiac killer?
So why do you come to Cleveland in 1978? What are you running from and where are you?
After years, a break in the case thanks to new DNA technology.
We had a little bit of real bad DNA. So it was kind of like a Hail Mary play.
Chandler's real name revealed, but will it be enough to find out why he was hiding? I'm Sarah Goldenberg. I'm taking you inside one man's double life and the search for answers in Running from Robert. In a sober living house in Cincinnati, where hills overlook the Ohio River and the Kentucky state line.
It's been a blessing for me. Getting sober was the best thing I could do in my life.
Phil Nichols lives a simple life. A simple life, it would turn out, much like his father's in his last years. A father he never really knew.
He sent me an envelope, no letter in it. After that, he just more or less vanished.
Until one day, a knock at his door changed everything, making him rethink his whole childhood and everything he thought he knew about his father and his family. On a hot, humid July day back in 2002, in the small city of Eastlake near Cleveland, hugging the shore of Lake Erie, something wasn't quite right.
Just flies, covering the windows of the apartment.
Police called by the landlord to check on a bad odor. So bad, they borrowed gas masks from firefighters to get through the door.
It was a studio apartment, so it just had a bed that came out of the wall, a small kitchen area, a bathroom to the right.
Detective Ted Krozak with Eastlake Police, now retired, knew from experience what he would find next.
I looked inside the bathroom and saw the body on the floor, almost in a face-down, fetal-type position.
So badly decomposed, the person was unrecognizable.
But as I lifted the body, we did notice that there was a handgun underneath the body.
At this point, all of the clues point to a suicide, but something seems out of place.
We noticed just some odd things about the apartment. Who was living there lived like a super simple life. Very little clothing, very little personal items, I think in the closet there was like one jacket and maybe a tie. We were able to find the wallet and identification, things like that.
The Ohio license read Joseph Newton Chandler III.
Everything we had, everything we looked at that was in the apartment was to Joseph Chandler.
A week earlier, Chandler had locked all of his doors, shut the windows, and shot himself in the head. It turns out he had colon cancer at the time. Here's Eastlake Police Chief Larry Reich.
Once everything matches up, you kind of get it all filed away, and there's no forcible entry into the house. There's nothing else to really look at.
Everything seemed to fit, that it was pretty much just a suicide at that point.
Police were pretty confident this man was Joseph Chandler, but they didn't have any fingerprints on the body to make a match, and no other clues either. No list of emergency contacts or doctor's notes.
They found very little, and what they did find didn't really lead to anything for a 100%, okay, this is definitely who this was. So it completed an investigation as you would expect for a suicide with a guy with a wallet, with everything else corresponding.
But something was still missing. Where was this man's family? After some more digging, detectives uncovered a secret. The man living a quiet, simple life in that tiny apartment had concealed for decades. Here's U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott.
As they figured out he had $82,000 in his bank account, and they went to locate his next of kin, and the next of kin unveiled that the real Joseph Newton Chandler died in 1945.
Joseph Chandler, or the individual we had that committed suicide, took the identity of a deceased child. And then it started snowballing from there.
Who was the real Joseph Newton Chandler, and what did this man have to hide? Investigators learned Joseph Newton Chandler III was an 8-year-old boy from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He died tragically in a car accident with his family before Christmas in Texas back in 1945.
Was that surprising to you when you heard that he had stolen someone's identity?
Yeah, I found it unusual. I was like, I wonder why he would have did that.
People aren't going to live in a very nondescript apartment complex, simple studio apartment without much means for no reason. There just has to be something more to it.
Even if you took on another identity, why would you live a life like that, you know?
Try to get into his mind a little bit. He knows that he had someone else's identity. He knew he was committing suicide. So what is he going to do before he does that? Likely clean up the place and leave as little of his own evidence there.
And that's exactly what this man, living under the name Joseph Chandler, left behind for detectives. Luckily, they'd taken extra photos of the scene and had a full case file ready for the next unexpected step of the investigation.
The question is, why? So why do you come to Cleveland in 1978? Why do you live under the name of a 8-year-old boy who died in 1945 in a car accident?
Why did this man choose this child's name to steal? And what was he running from? U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott picked up the case file 10 years after the man known as Joseph Chandler was found dead in Eastlake. Elliott's dad, a retired deputy U.S. Marshal, had worked the case.
Yeah, he had worked on it as a private investigator in the past. I don't remember the year, but he still had the report, so I remember reaching out to him.
What stood out to you about this case?
It was unsolved, number one. Number two, it was probably, at that time, I think it was one of Cleveland's top 10 most unsolvable cases, right? And so those are the type of cases that we wanted to take a look at because we thought that whoever would utilize the name of an 8-year-old boy who died in 1945 and lived here in the Cleveland area for all those years was hiding from something.
Could the U.S. Marshal uncover this man's true identity?
You had this mystery that, nobody knew his true identity and why he was hiding.
They started combing through the evidence and trying to trace what they could.
That's his watch, that's a gun that he used. We actually found that gun originally, they thought traced to Texas, but it did trace back to Ohio. Glasses, this is some kind of ruby fluid that he had in his possession. Everything here we traced.
He didn't have many possessions, but he did have 2 books.
Fingerprinted every one of those pages at that time and received no fingerprints.
In fact, no fingerprints were found anywhere in his apartment.
Is that unusual?
It's happened before, so, typically you want to, be able to get fingerprints. If we had fingerprints, it would have been a lot easier.
U.S. Marshals tracked down when and where this man got Joseph Chandler's Social Security card.
We knew he had to go missing before 1978 because he assumed the identity of Chandler in South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota, in 1978.
Elliott started looking at unsolved fugitive cases from the 60s and 70s across the country, starting in San Francisco with the infamous Alcatraz prison escapees. All they had was one photo of the man known as Joseph Chandler from the 90s and some very basic information.
So we knew his height. His height was 5'7". That was what was listed on his driver's license. We knew an approximate age of him, which we were able to ascertain, and that matched up with one of the escapees. So we took a look at that to figure out if we can get DNA off one of the relatives.
But how could they match the DNA from one of the relatives of the Alcatraz escapees to the man who died under Joseph Chandler's name when he had been cremated years before? U.S. Marshals found Chandler had undergone surgery.
But in Ohio, they're required to keep tissue samples for 7 years after somebody has a procedure.
So they pulled his medical records and found an untested DNA sample.
We were able to get that DNA sample and and then had that tested here in Cuyahoga County. So now we had DNA. So we were able to put that in a national system called POTUS, but we got no hits back. So then we started going individually to different places and trying to get DNA from relatives of people that we thought Chandler could be.
From California to Wyoming and back to Ohio, the list of fugitives he could have been stacked up.
What does that feel like when you think you have it, but you hit a dead end?
You know, you're feeling good about it. You're thinking that, hey, this is it. This is going to be who he really is. And then you just hit a dead end. It's like, go back at it.
A few years of searching and still no answers. This man wasn't an escapee from Alcatraz or any of their other suspects.
Frustrating times because, you know, its success is going from failure to failure with great enthusiasm. And we were so close sometimes and thought, this has to be him.
Still to come, groundbreaking investigative techniques push the bounds of science with DNA and genealogy.
The whole Facebook group, everybody, the website lights up. We think we have it. So I called Margaret. I said, get your butt out of bed right now.
Will finding another piece of the puzzle uncover this man's secret? In 2016, a phone call would change everything. U.S. Marshals took a big risk on DNA that paid off in a big way.
So I heard about this forensic genealogist in California, and we just made a call to her and said, hey, look, we have this tissue sample. It's badly degraded. Can you help us?
Yes, he reached out to me to do.
Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick has a PhD in nuclear physics. She's a pioneer in the field of investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG. She took a look at the degraded DNA profile.
He gave me the YSTR profile that the crime lab had created.
Fitzpatrick worked on the case with Dr. Margaret Press. They went on to co-found the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit that uses DNA technology and genealogy to identify John and Jane Does. They wanted to try a new technique used for adoptees looking for their birth parents for unsolved cases like this.
So I can imagine, two little old ladies coming to him saying, we can solve this case. And he's thinking, well, I'll try anything. This was brand new. Nobody had brought it up yet.
Fitzpatrick already had a starting point. She'd found Chandler's DNA hits matched the last name of Nichols or Nicholas. Now they had a true last name, and she found a genealogist in the Nicholas family who had traced his ancestors back. All the way back to the 1700s to a prominent family with thousands of descendants. Fitzpatrick and Press wanted to do a workaround to find the real identity of Joseph Chandler. Since they couldn't use private genealogy databases like Ancestry and 23andMe, they decided to try GEDmatch, a public ancestry database, using this SNP testing method known as IgG.
You have DNA from somebody and you don't know who it is. You get them tested, they look at the matches, you build a family tree, you figure out who they are.
They're one step ahead with his last name, but there was another major challenge.
We didn't have fresh DNA. We had a little bit of real bad DNA. So it was kind of like a Hail Mary play.
They had only 12% of Chandler's whole DNA. So Fitzpatrick experimented, degrading her own DNA and uploading it to GEDmatch. She found the data still worked. She still got her family matches. Now they were ready to upload his DNA profile. A number of matches came back for the man known as Joseph Chandler, now a Nichols or Nicholas. They did find third and fourth cousins, but they were too distant. 2 years into it, Fitzpatrick and Press took a gamble using the last bit of DNA extract. It paid off, leading them to a new relative match.
So we get really excited. We keep building these trees. And then somebody notices there's a Mr. Nichols with, I think, 3 or 4 sons. And the mother and daughter connected to him, and the new match connected to a Mrs. Nichols.
They had noticed this family in the large tree of relatives before, and that's where the deeper investigation into them started.
We had the birth, marriage, death of 3 sons, but we couldn't find the death of the 4th son. So we started looking at him better, more closely. Turned out that we had a lot of documentation on Mr. X along the way since he changed his identity.
Including this address on a rental application from Joseph Chandler, where he gave a sister as a reference, a sister who supposedly lived in Columbus at 1823 Center Street. It was the same address as one of the son's house where he was born, 1823 Center Street, but in New Albany, Indiana.
So that really made us think we had the right guy. We got his high school graduation picture, we had his military records. He had married, he was divorced, he had 3 sons, one was deceased.
One son lived in Ohio, the other lived in Georgia. Fitzpatrick shared this news with the volunteers working on the case.
The whole Facebook group, everybody, the website lights up. We think we have it. So I called Margaret. I said, get your butt out of bed right now. So she gets up and we work all night trying to prove this, make sure we didn't make a mistake.
After more than 1,500 hours of science and research, even help from the DNA matches themselves, everything lined up. It was DNA Doe Project's first solve. Early the next morning, Fitzpatrick and Press called U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott.
And Margaret says, we solved it, and his name is Robert Ivan Nichols. And the marshal was like, oh my God,
All of this from a degraded tissue sample.
It is the first case in the history of the U.S. Marshal Service that we've utilized forensic genealogy to solve the case.
Who was this man? The man who may have stolen the identity of Joseph Chandler. Robert Ivan Nichols was born in southern Indiana in 1926, right across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky.
He had gone missing out of Indiana. He sent letters to his family members in California in 1965. So she was able to come with his family tree and say, hey, this is who this person was. And that's good, but we need a little more, right?
Coming up, tracking down the son of Robert Ivan Nichols.
Was he a psychopath? Have you taken that dark trail? I don't know, I can't say.
And tracing his secret life from the Midwest all the way to the West Coast. It turns out tracking down one of the sons of Robert Ivan Nichols wouldn't be hard to do. He was living in the same state. But would that bring U.S. Marshals any closer to figuring out why Robert left and started a new life as Joseph?
So, get in the car, we drive down Cincinnati and knock on the door.
So, my neighbor that lives on this first floor, he says, Bill, you got somebody at the front door. I go, okay. So I come down.
And I looked through the glass, and I thought I was looking right at Joseph Newton Chandler.
And I'm thinking, what is this? And right away, they identified themselves, and he said, first thing we want to let you know is you're not in any trouble. What they had in the Cleveland area was this Joseph Newton Chandler had committed suicide. They couldn't find an accurate history, so now they're trying to find out who is this man.
So we showed him the picture, and he said, that's my dad. He hasn't seen it since, again, early 1960s.
How did that moment feel?
That felt good because we were finally there, right? But with that said, we were at the first step.
They now know Joseph Chandler's real identity is Robert Nichols, once a DNA sample from Phil gets confirmed by the lab. But the big question, why did Robert run and live under a stolen identity for decades? For that, they needed to go back to the beginning. So we did too, tracing Robert's roots. Robert Ivan Nichols, the son of Silas and Alpha, was born in this modest house in 1926 in New Albany, Indiana. He grew up with 2 brothers and went to New Albany High School. He sang in the school choir. Here he is in his yearbook from back in 1944. That spring, he joined the Navy, just like his older brother, serving in the Pacific on a ship.
They told me he was a fireman, but what that meant was that he fed the furnaces. Kept the engines running.
In 1945, the Japanese attacked his ship.
So the attacks were severe, And then of course, they brought in the kamikaze.
Robert was on the worst hit part of the ship with 15 other men. Only 4 survived. He later told his hometown newspaper, "It was 52 minutes of hell, and death stared me in the face." Robert rushed to help the other sailors, not noticing he was injured himself.
Dad was knocked down, he was wounded. He caught a lot of shrapnel.
Robert later received a Purple Heart. He would never forget what he experienced that day.
Of course, nowadays they recognize that PTSD is a real thing.
Robert never talked about it. Phil only knew the story of what happened when his dad got back from his grandmother.
He gets back, he threw his uniforms in the coal bin at home.
Burning that uniform, Phil says, wasn't him being unpatriotic. He had just become a pacifist.
He loved this country, but he hated the war.
Back in New Albany, Robert stayed busy, playing in a band and square dancing.
He was playing stand-up bass. They had a 3 or 4 piece band, him and a couple other guys.
That's how he met his wife, Laverne Corti.
She would go to the dances with Grandpa. Dad was playing in the band, and that's how they met. And it wasn't too long before they were married, and then it wasn't too much longer after that before I was born.
Phil's story, just like his dad's, starts in New Albany, Indiana, in the same house on Center Street. He remembers playing in the woods and riding bikes.
That was a fairly pleasant time in my life.
His dad spent a lot of time tinkering in the garage.
But that's where Dad built his kayak and his machine gun, and all that was in that garage.
But they wouldn't stay long. They moved across the river for his dad's new job at this GE plant in Kentucky. His dad was an engineer, an industrial draftsman. They lived in this house in a quiet neighborhood.
We would go on camping trips, which I loved. Once again, out in the woods, you know. Every so often, Dad would take us to a ball game.
But then things started to change.
Dad would be there in the evenings. He worked days at GE. He would be there in the evenings and on weekends, and had very little interaction with us. Things within the home were deteriorating. Mom and Dad were always good about, or the Cleavers were the perfect 50s family, you know, to the public. But behind doors, it was a totally different thing.
Robert and Laverne split up.
Well, first he bought a new car, and then he left us. Never paid a dime in child support, not a dime. Left us with a mortgage on the house, an old beat-up Chevrolet, and 3 kids in school. I think Dad had been planning this for a little while. You know, we're still talking 50s and 60s. In those days, usually Mom was at home, you know. But he encouraged her to go out and get a job.
Robert took his engineering skills up north to Dearborn, Michigan, where he worked for a company that designed race cars. One time, out of nowhere, he bought his kids bus tickets to come up and visit.
But kept us in a motel. And I mean, certainly he must have had an apartment somewhere.
Looking back as an adult, Phil wonders why. Why a hotel? And why was that the only time they saw him in Michigan?
Why the 3 of us kids couldn't come and visit there, you know? That was never asked, never questioned.
Robert stayed in Michigan for less than a year. Then he told his family he was off to California.
After that, he just more or less vanished.
Next, vanished without a trace. What happened to Robert Nichols?
He was in Oklahoma at one point on his way to the West Coast, but then something happened.
His mother never stopped looking for him. Even after his death, U.S. Marshals want answers too. Heading west and disappearing off the map. Why did Robert Ivan Nichols go missing? The story makes headlines.
But this is a very intriguing cold case that has apparently been solved out of Eastlake.
The true identity of Joseph Newton Chandler finally revealed to the public.
Robert Ivan Nichols never wanted to be found throughout his lifetime, even into his death. And someone out there may hold the key as to why.
This has put to rest, or at least partially, a mystery within our family.
After so many years of not knowing what happened to his dad, Phil now had some answers. They'd been separated by just a 4-hour drive in the same state. But why would a father never reach out to his son and live under a stolen identity for so long? What was Robert hiding? 1964 was a pivotal year for Robert Nichols. It's the year he left his family, left Kentucky, and started over.
Never paid a dime in child support. Not a dime.
What was his life like in Dearborn, Michigan? One letter Robert sent his parents in August of 1964 gives us a small glimpse.
My new job is going well, and they seem to like me, although it's really too early to tell. I know I'm being watched, and I'll have to prove myself.
Robert writes he's living in a rooming house, and he started going to church again.
I thought it would be a good time to start again since my moving up here was kind of a new beginning. I've made many new friends in the 2 short weeks that I've been here.
Robert tells his parents his landlord removed the phone, so the only number he could give them was his work number.
I checked today in the office and they said I could only receive emergency calls, and that in most cases they would take the message and have me call back.
By making contacting him so difficult, was Robert already setting up his disappearance? He didn't stay in Michigan long. Robert sent his parents a postcard in early 1965, stamped in Stroud, Oklahoma, a small town halfway between Tulsa and Oklahoma City on Interstate 44, which parallels the famous Route 66. He tells them he's heading out west and not to worry.
He was in Oklahoma at one point on his way to the West Coast, but then something happened.
There are 2 things ironic or even too coincidental to miss about Robert passing through Oklahoma. For one, years later, he would steal the identity of a young boy from Tulsa, a boy with the last name Chandler, the same name as a town just miles away from Stroud, where this postcard was sent from. What, if anything, was Robert Nichols' connection to Oklahoma? At some point, he reaches out to his son Phil, now 18 and in the military, and what he sends seems like some sort of riddle.
He sent me an envelope, no letter in it. The only thing that was inside the envelope was a penny. That was postmarked Napa, California. There was no return address. And my name and address were written in 2 different handwritings. I wish I'd have kept it. After that, he just more or less vanished.
The last time any of his family heard from him was March 1965. Robert mailed a letter to his parents from Richmond, California, just north of San Francisco. He says he has a job and likes living there.
It looks like I'll get to see a lot of the West Coast. Please do not worry about me. I am well and happy. I will write as often as I can and let you know how I am doing.
So in 65, he just disappears off the face of the earth.
A few months later, on July 4th, Robert sends a letter to this courthouse in Louisville, written in his signature handwriting, block letters in all caps, asking for a copy of his divorce papers. Why did he suddenly need them? And why was the address he gave the court in Los Angeles, not Northern California, where he told his parents he was living?
The mom and the dad searched for him for years, up until their death, and they can't find him.
They put a missing persons notice in their local newspaper, and she wrote dozens of letters to the sheriff, highway patrol, the cities of San Francisco and Richmond, Salvation Army Missing Persons Unit, even the Weather Bureau in San Francisco, checking to see if there had been any severe storms he fell victim to, and the Navy to check if he had re-enlisted. Nothing. Years pass, and in 1971, a sign of hope. Robert's mother wouldn't give up on finding her son.
Grandma was, she could be emotional, but she was in tears, and she was saying there was a very nice lady that was trying to help her at Social Security.
If somewhere out there Robert had a job, he would be paying into Social Security.
The lady comes, looks in the files and comes back and says, I can't tell you anything other than someone is paid into this account. But she wouldn't tell Mom what city, who the employers were, none of that. It really broke Grandma's heart because she was that close, but at least she knew that her son was still alive.
Coming up, an unaccounted for gap in time.
So there was a year when he went off the grid. No, we tried to find out what he could have been doing.
Plus, why did Robert Nichols choose to become Joseph Chandler?
So he had to know something about that family to assume that kid's identity.
Where was Robert Nichols from 1965 when he went out to California to 1978 when he turned up in Ohio as Joseph Chandler? And is it possible he was one of America's most notorious serial killers?
A search for answers in a case like this sometimes seems to get lost in the depths, as deep as the Great Lakes.
But there's still a question is why? Why did he run away from his family and change his identity and live like this?
There's a reason this individual, Robert Nichols, was running.
The gaps in time left a lot of questions behind.
We looked at his Social Security records up through about 1976, and you could see, he was earning more and more money. And then in 77, it goes blank. In 78, Mr. Chandler's Social Security picks up. So there was a year when he went off the grid.
Back then, it was a lot easier to assume someone else's identity. Robert Nichols was 11 years older than the real Joseph Chandler. He got a copy of the boy's birth certificate from a hospital in Buffalo, New York, mailed it to Rapid City, South Dakota, and not long after, walked out of there with Chandler's Social Security card.
So he had to know something about that family to assume that kid's identity.
Robert's son Phil thinks maybe a shipmate from the Navy gave him the idea.
I could see Dad doing research, how to change a person's identity. We could go back in records, municipal records, and with the right maneuvers, I could claim that identity.
Over the years, Robert, now known as Joseph, worked as an engineering draftsman at a few different companies not far from where he lived.
He's here for 25 years, which is a big gap in years, under a fake name, working at a company under a fake name, living a life under a fake name.
The new Joseph Chandler's life in a Cleveland suburb seemed pretty ordinary, except for some strange behavior here and there. Co-workers told police he listened to white noise for hours at a time. And one day he drove to Maine just to go to an LL Bean. And when he couldn't find a parking spot, he turned around and drove all the way back home.
They all thought he was odd, different, kept to himself, but they never thought in a million years that he was somebody else.
One red flag to U.S. Marshals, co-workers said he always had a suitcase packed.
And you say that too, that, they're getting close to me. I have to go. And he'd disappear for 6 months at a time. At one point, he told one of his associates that he had something to tell him one day, but he never said what that one thing was.
After news broke of Joseph Chandler's real identity, a theory took hold online based off of these pictures side by side. In the late 1960s, the now infamous Zodiac Killer terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area, murdering at least 5 victims, taunting police and the media, sending letters confessing to the crimes, many including these ciphers. More than 50 years later, the identity of the Zodiac Killer still remains a mystery.
As we were spitballing different ideas of the most grandiose, do you have just a normal guy or do you have the Zodiac Killer?
On the surface, some details seem to fit. Nichols' age, height, weight, and how he dressed matched the suspect's description. And the timeline did too. He moved to Northern California and went missing just before the Zodiac Killer's first known murders.
There are some wild theories out there about who your father could have been. Do you want to know the truth, no matter what it is?
Yeah. Of course, yeah. I'd like to know one way or the other. They're trying to link him to what, the Zodiac Killer? Is that right? And he will, the time frame fits. Could he have gone? Was he a psychopath? Have he taken that dark trail? I don't know, I can't say. The person that I knew, I would say no, he would never do something like that. You know, he was just such a good-natured person.
At first, even their handwriting seems to match, and both had poor spelling. Here's Nichols' capital block lettering next to the ciphers from the Zodiac Killer. But a closer look shows discrepancies with certain letters of the alphabet, and the letters written to police were in lowercase.
Yeah, his handwriting is kind of telling, and usually people typically don't change their handwriting over the period of time. Mm-hmm. They always remain consistent in that.
We looked into maybe there was some speculation he was a Zodiac Killer. Don't take that too seriously, okay? Everybody looks like the Zodiac Killer. Even me, if I...
With the glasses.
Yeah, right.
U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott looked into it, but found no physical evidence linking Nichols to the Zodiac Killer. For now, he's moved on to other theories.
So you don't think this is an innocent, simple reason why he gave up that name?
I don't think people go to those at that extent to just run from a family.
What was Robert Nichols hiding? Was he a fugitive or suffering from paranoia and PTSD?
He just said, would you be interested in finding out about your dad?
Plus, did someone know where Robert was all of those years he was missing?
All of those years on the run, did someone close to Robert Nichols know where he was? His son believes so after a surprise encounter at his grandmother's funeral.
On some days, all of the unanswered questions about his dad rush through Phil's mind, like the currents of the Ohio River he grew up near.
What did he do for those 20 years? You know, what was happening? He obviously had to be living somewhere.
Phil feels like he was so close to finding out, but missed his chance.
Do you think any family members or friends maybe knew where he was that whole time? Do you think he kept in touch with anyone?
I believe he kept in touch with his brother Marvin.
Phil hadn't seen his Uncle Marvin since the 60s, until he showed up at his grandmother's funeral.
He just said, would you be interested in finding out about your dad? And I said, not particularly. I'm still mad at him. But I said, Mom would sure love to know where he's at because he owes child support for 20 years.
He regrets that answer to this day.
If I could have a do-over, I would say yes, I would love to get in contact with him. Just to kind of set things straight.
Phil never saw his Uncle Marvin again. He's since passed away.
Going to your grandmother's funeral and he's not there at his own mother's funeral.
Right.
Missing big milestones.
That speaks of paranoia to me.
Could paranoia or PTSD be the reason Robert Nichols disappeared, stole a little boy's identity, and hid for more than 2 decades? For police, it's hard to imagine that was enough.
Yeah, the motive, the pure motive would always help, kind of that final piece.
And really, how could you live that many years like this? I mean, it must have been hard life for the guy.
From an Alcatraz escape to a serial killer, a bank robber, a war criminal, or a spy, U.S. Marshals have looked into all kinds of theories and came up with no links to Robert. Could solving the reason why Robert Nichols was hiding crack another big case out there somewhere? U.S. Marshals are looking at unsolved murders in California right now.
There's one thing out there that we're missing that we just haven't been able to find yet. I just don't know what that one thing is. There's something, but I feel in my gut that there is something significant out there.
Sometimes Phil wonders how life would have turned out if he could go back in time and change another decision he made as a teenager.
Dad had come over to the house, wanted to know if I would come and live with him. He would take custody of me. I said, no, why would I want to do that, But I do remember the last thing I said to him is go to hell. I'm 16 years old and I'm walking out the back door of the house and just telling him, go straight to hell. And my gosh, I wish I'd never said that.
Robert never met any of his 14 grandchildren. His disappearance and double life continues to ripple across the generations that have come after him.
I don't have the animosity. I'm not resentful. I'm not angry with him for leaving.
Maybe the answers everyone is looking for died with Robert Nichols. And here at this cemetery on a hill in Northeast Ohio, all that remains is the name Joseph Newton Chandler engraved in stone. A reminder that we don't really know much about this mysterious man at all.
What would you have said to him or asked him if you had the chance?
I would have went up to visit and tried to reconcile, especially after I got sober. I've come to realize there are so many more important things in life, and family is one of them.
The U.S. Marshals Office isn't giving up hope they'll solve this case one day. They could be one tip away from finding out why Robert Ivan Nichols was running. If you have any information, call U.S. Marshals at 1-866-4-WANTED. I'm Sarah Goldenberg. Thanks for watching Running from Robert.